Hello and welcome back, everybody. We are the SIDELINE Project with our SIDELINE PLATICAS. We are your hosts and co-founders.
Is Jocelyn Lopez, and I'm one of the co-founders.
My name is Joanna Sanchez. I'm one of the co-founders.
And my name is Giselle Gonzalez. I'm also one of the co-founders.
And me, Jorge. So today's topic for our Platica is local elections, the importance of voting, and why should we care. Today we have the pleasure of bringing our very own first guest. She was born in Mexico City, but was brought to Aurora when she was 9 months old. She's a proud West Sider, graduated from West Aurora High School in 2006, moved to NYC, New York City, and graduated from Columbia University in 2010. Since then, she's worked in DC for Senator Durbin and then spent a few years in New York City advocating for state-level sexual assault reform. She missed home and moved back to Aurora a year ago and has been working with State Rep Barbara Hernandez as chief of staff since since then, outside of work, she loves educating the local community about government and policy and advocacy. She is Liliana Rocha.
Hi, everyone. But please feel free to call me Lily.
Okay, so it's so great, and we are so happy to have you. So the purpose of this Platica is to understand why local politics are to be taken with great importance due to its immediate effect upon its citizens. As citizens, advocates, and lobbyists, why is it essential to have some understanding of the levels of government?
So I think essentially, kind of like I think it'd be cool if you can give us like a breakdown of government first, maybe like local or both statewide, and then going down to local, just so that we can get an idea of how that looks like, because we're always hearing, like this got passed and this or this didn't, and so it's never really like, well, does it matter? Like, at what level is it?
Yeah, no, that's great. And thanks for having me on, you guys. I really love talking about this, so I'm excited to be here. But yeah, I can talk a little bit about the structure of government and then kind of how we as, citizens or undocumented folks or, just tax-paying residents, affect the government. So there's really three levels of it. So we have the federal government, which is based in Washington, D.C. And that's, the president, Congress, which is made out of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the Supreme Court. So those three branches are, comprise the federal government. And then we have the state, which is based in Springfield. They pass state laws, and we have the governor, who is the executive, and then the Illinois House of Representatives and the Illinois Senate, which collectively we call the Illinois General Assembly. And then we have the state Supreme Court. And then at the local level, there's a few, and I think this is where it gets kind of confusing, is where there's a few different levels. So local level, usually you think of your town's government. So in Aurora, there's the Aurora City Council and then the Aurora Mayor. Which are definitely the people that set in place a lot of policy at the local level, regarding things that affect only Aurora. However, one thing that I don't think most people realize is that sometimes, especially with us, it's actually not the cities that set school budgets, it's actually school districts. So if you look at the city's budget, you're not going to find, the line items for school, you're going to find those in the school districts. And so those are made up of the governing body there is called the school board. And the school board is made out of the chair and a few other people who are elected to office to make budgeting and policy decisions for the entire district. And also at the community college level, you have the board of trustees. And so those are people who are elected as well to kind of be the governing body for the community college. And then, you have a few other different ones, like you have precinct committeemen, which is the smallest political unit, and each party has a PC, is what we called, and that PC has a turf that's maybe a small neighborhood or a small part of the neighborhood, and their job is to try to get voter turnout. You also have the park district. The park district has elected officials, and so they're elected to also be part of that governing body that oversees how park district works. So you see, there's a few different levels of government, so I totally understand if you feel overwhelmed, if you're like, oh my God, I don't know who did this, or is this Congress, or is this state? I could tell you it's usually one or the other that has jurisdiction over the issue, but there is interplay with the other levels. For example, school funding for K through 12, it's primarily, the funding for that primarily comes through property taxes. So that's, property taxes are assessed and collected and distributed at the local level. But that's also not to say that the state and the federal government pitch in for K through 12 education. They do, but the federal government does a little bit, the state does a little bit more, and the local level does a lot more, at least how it is here locally. And so, there are roles for everybody to play, but it's kind of knowing what levels we should be focusing on. And I think that's kind of, where the advocacy portion of this comes in is, I just want to say that I think this is great that you guys are having this, because I think sometimes people feel intimidated, being like, oh my God, like I'm so angry, like I want to do something. Like you go to marches, you're like pumped and you're like, I'm going to make systemic change. But then you're like, how do I do that? And I think one of the ways that you really effectively do that is just by doing this, learning a little bit about how it works. So I would encourage you to, spend some time Googling things and just kind of reading some news articles of, who's where, who's what. And sometimes, I've noticed that reporters may not themselves know. So it'll be like, this law was passed by blah, blah, blah. It's in the passive voice. And I'm like, who passed it? It's the House passed it. Which house? Is it the federal house or is it the state house? So kind of being able to kind of understand how that works. And you guys are also, college students. I would say hit up your college professors, your poli-sci professors, and ask them, be like, can you explain to me a little bit about how this works? And so I think those are really great ways to get involved. But then, yeah, in terms of, I think you guys had an idea, how do you actually make change? And I will say it is contact with your elected officials. And so oftentimes, this is what lobbying is. I think we think of lobbyists as big bad boogeymen who are, coming to congressmen with like bags of money. They're like, vote my way and you get this money, right? But actually it doesn't happen like that. I've worked for legislators and I can tell you that the reason lobbyists are effective is because they're specific, they're consistent, they're persuasive, they are really, they're well connected with other lobbyists who are also on their same messaging. So I would say, try to replicate some of those tactics by you yourself figuring out, one, what is it that you're really mad about? Perhaps you're really mad about climate change, or perhaps you're really mad about police reform. So kind of, hone in on the issue. Then do a little research, like who actually sets policies on that? Is this a local level policy? Is this state policy? And if you don't know, feel free to ask. Again, you have your poli-sci professors, you have, your wonderful board here who can help you do some research. Reach out to some legislative staff that and kind of use your resources there. And then secondly, think about, are you, what do you want to say? Like, what is your ask? If you're worried about climate change, is it that you want to reduce carbon emissions? Is it that you want to, change the economy to be more sustainable by switching production practices? And what does that look like? And then if you're, looking at police reform, are you wanting to reform training? Are you wanting to implement policies that ban use of force? Are you wanting to, have more mental health advocates be part of the police department? Kind of start thinking about specifically, what do you want? And I will say that, if you're able to look at budgets, I know the city of Aurora has their budget online. kind of look at, how much money is spent where, and kind of think about, what would I want in terms of dollars and cents? Because I will tell you that legislators often think about things not just in terms of policy, but also how much it costs. So if you guys are able to kind of do a little bit of that digging and be like, we saw that you spent X amount of dollars on this program, but if you take away 10% and put it to X program, you can see more results, blah, blah, blah. And that's kind of where you come up with your pitch. Of course, you don't have to be super policy oriented if you really don't have time or if you feel overwhelmed. I think just having a baseline idea of what reform you want to see and sharing your story about why you want to see that is going to be super helpful. So, maybe your family has been targeted by the Aurora Police Department, or maybe, your family is having to migrate because, the waters are actually taking over their land. And so that stuff is really also going to resonate with people. So don't feel like you have to be a policy expert. By no means do you have to do that. And then it's going up to your elected officials. So that's kind of where you do a little bit of Googling of finding them. And again, looking at who's my federal, who's my state, who's my local. And the way you contact them is you can either email them or call them. I will say at the federal level, it's difficult to actually meet with the elected official, partly because they represent so many people and they're flying in and out of DC all the time. So, you might meet with a staffer, which is totally fine. That's totally acceptable. But at the state and local level is where you have the opportunity to actually meet with that person a little bit more. But let's say you're like, I don't know if I want to meet them. I feel a little intimidated. Like I kind of would rather just call or maybe email. Email is really effective. So you can find their emails and just kind of send them the email. Be like, would you support this? Or would you support reforming, APD by blah, blah, blah? Or would you support, addressing the climate issue by, implementing these reforms? And then you can say, I'd like a reply. And if you don't support these reforms, I'd like to know why not. So kind of that's holding them accountable, asking them about their position, asking them to tell you if there's a difference in their position and yours, and then asking them, well, what are your solutions? And so it's kind of having those conversations with them, and legislators are, I think, very sensitive to these types of emails because oftentimes what they hear from the most are, like lobbyists or groups. It makes sense that I would hear from, in climate change, I would hear about from the Sierra Club. Like I get that, right? But if I just hear from a couple random constituents that have never reached out to me and all of a sudden they're kind of just emailing me, I'm like, oh my God, people are like actually talking about this. This is something that people care. And, sometimes once they told me when I was first starting out, I was interning in the New York City Council when I was in college, and they're like, government is about who's the loudest. And I didn't really know what he meant, but now I kind of get it. And it's loud with, yes, chants and petitions and protests and marching. I think you do need that. But you also need to be loud in front of the legislators themselves or the governing board. So if you really want to change, for example, there's a Wabansi policy that you guys are really upset about, it's finding who the decision maker is. It's most likely the board of trustees, and going to them, emailing them, asking them about it. And I think one thing too is that people also tend to be very adversarial at the beginning, which is understandable because a lot of times you're reaching out because you have all these emotions about it. But I would say is, give people a chance, especially if they're like somewhat decent politicians. I think there's some more than others that I'm like, I'm not giving you a chance because I've seen your character. But just kind of engage in a dialogue with them. Be like, hey, I hear this policy is happening, and to be honest, I'm kind of upset about it because this is how it's going to affect me and my family, but I'd like to know more. Is this policy going to happen? Do you support it? If so, can you tell me why? And just kind of having that conversation. Now, if they come back and they're completely disrespectful or they're completely like give you something that's just wrong or like not in line with what you were thinking, then that's when I think you can be a little bit more forthcoming. And that's where you maybe apply some public pressure too, this is where you might want to engage the media and be like, oh my God, I talked to, my elected official and they yelled at me, they're yelling at a constituent. So something like that, thinking about harnessing the power of the media. But, I know a lot of students who are undocumented feel like they can't do this, right? They feel like, oh, well, you know, they might feel fear, you know, especially for their families if their families aren't documented too. They might feel like because they can't vote, you know, they can't talk to their legislators. They might feel just like imposter syndrome. I know all these things are very prevalent in our community. But I will just say that you have a strong voice and you have a lot of leverage regardless of your immigration status. And I just want you to know that they're not going to ask you that. And if they do, I think, again, that's kind of where you talk to the media and you're kind of like, so-and-so is, you know, not responding to his undocumented constituents. And if you feel like you really, really can't, you know, I think this is where you enlist the help of friends who are residents or citizens and be like, hey, can you help me? I really want to say this, but I can't. And, you know, once or twice I've seen emails from constituents being like, I'm sending this on behalf of my friend who is too scared, you know, to say anything because of her family, but here's what she wants you to know. And, you know, they get me a story about, you know, why she wants this reform. And so
I think, oh, I'm sorry
Oh,
to
no.
interrupt, but I was going to say that's a great example of when the Rights Act was trying to get passed. We had students of all statuses who were calling in, sending emails to legislators to make sure that it got passed. And so I think that's a great example of how really your status, you know, doesn't matter, and your legislator is supposed to still represent you, still be there for you. And I know a lot of folks were doing this through emails, through phone calls, without necessarily having to go in person, because going in person can definitely be intimidating for someone who may be undocumented. I want to go back though to something that you said about the Board of Trustees. I think that, and I don't know about everyone else, but for me specifically, like, I had no idea the power and the influence that the Board of Trustees at our institutions, at our colleges had. And it wasn't until I got involved that I really was like, oh, like, these people exist. And so would you be able to expand a little bit more about the role of the Board of Trustees in college, just for the sake of everyone being college students, and of course, like, a lot of the work that we do sometimes tends to be in educational institutions. So would you be able to expand a little bit on what exactly the work of Board of Trustees do, and the influence they may have on college communities?
I could try a little bit. To be very honest, I've never worked with a community community college board of trustees, and I've never really worked in higher education. So I'm a little agnostic about that. So I'll preface it with, I'm maybe not the subject matter expert for this, but I think this is maybe where you guys invite you know, a member of the Board of Trustees to come and speak to you guys about what it is that they do. And again, I think this is how you hold people accountable, right? It's like you reach out to them, you come and you have them explain. And it doesn't always have to be like, explain your policy position on this. It could just be explain your job. Like, what do you do? What's, you know, what powers do you have? And I think something like that. But yeah, I mean, from what I understand, they're the governing body, and they set policies for the entire community college, right? And they're elected positions. So people tend to kind of, and I think this goes back to the larger question of finding out who the decision maker is, you know, because times we talk about systemic reform or the systems are messed up, and it can get very ambiguous as to who is actually running things and who's actually making the decisions that impact the system, right? I think let's not forget that a system is made up of people. And there are people who have disproportionate power based on either their status or their title or money, you know. And so finding out who those people are, who the decision makers are, is going to be instrumental in then getting them to actually make changes, right? And so, you know, thinking about how you lobby, but also, you know, thinking about maybe one day you guys yourselves run for Board of Trustees. And so you guys are the ones at the table just making the decisions and, you know, getting people behind you. But I think what I will say about that too is you also want people to be engaged in that process, because I've noticed that as much as I've noticed a disconnect between the conversations that some activists are having and the conversations that are happening in like the formal meetings of the governing body, like a city council meeting or a school board meeting. A lot of conversation, you know, I talked to a school board member where I was like, yeah, you know, people have concerns about ROTC being at East Aurora High School. And, you know, they were like, oh, nobody's ever said anything to me about it. So that's kind of where, like, you know, even though those conversations are happening, the elected officials, the ones who are in charge of setting the policy, were never told about that. But I think if there's pressure applied, again, this is where like consistent, specific, constant pressure comes into play. That's where change happens. And it's tough because it's a full-time job, right? That's why people are lobbyists full-time. That's why it's a career, because it takes full-time job to being able to track policy, understand it, being able to understand its implementation, refine it, because no law, I can guarantee you, no law is going to be perfect. No policy is going to be perfect. I'm sure at some point it'll have unintended consequences, or it'll be more costly than you thought it was going to be, or it's implemented incorrectly. Whatever the case may be, there's always going to have to be, you're going to have to come back at the table at some point or another and like renegotiate some of the deals. So keeping track of all of that long term is time consuming, right? But I think this is kind of where a group like you guys can come in handy, because you can divide up the work, and you guys don't feel like you all have to take it on. You know, somebody's like in charge of, you know, the email, somebody's in charge of doing the phone banking, somebody's in charge of following up, somebody's in charge of setting that calendar alert for a month. To email them again, because that's the other thing is I met with so many people when, you know, working for various legislators, and maybe a handful of them ever actually followed up, just to be like, hey, it was nice meeting with you. You talked about this bill, and the congresswoman said she was going to sign on, and just following up and being like, did she not? And I mean, a lot of this you can also Google, you know, like you can see the co-sponsors. But, you know, I had one person, I think of the years I've worked with legislators, being like, hey, I saw that the senator actually isn't in this legislation. He's not signed up for it. Like, can you tell me why? And I was like, oh, and I checked it, and it's just, he just hadn't heard of the bill. I mean, there was like thousands of bills, right? But they were like, oh yeah, that's a good bill, sign him on. And that's how we got him to be a co-sponsor of the bill. So sometimes it's like not even intentionally that they're like against the bill. It's just that there's so many things, especially for federal and state legislators, there's so many pieces of legislation coming through that it's impossible for any one of them to know all of the bills that are coming through. So that's kind of where you guys are able to hold them accountable too, is just bringing bills up to their attention that maybe they just missed because just simply out of sheer volume, right? But yeah, so I hope that answers your questions. I think I also went on a tangent there, but
No,
that's okay.
definitely. Yeah, no, and I'd say like talking about this, like it definitely can get expensive because this is so much, like you said, at the end of the day, like these systems are made up of people and it gets complicated and it's messy sometimes. And but I think to your point, like, right, I think with everything that's going on, holding people accountable, whether it's holding police departments, whether it's holding legislators accountable, I think that's really what constituents or what community members are in search for. I think that they're wanting to hold people accountable, but they don't know where to start. And so thank you for sharing that. I love that, very useful information. I do want to talk a little bit about like registering to vote and you know and all of that. Like, are we automatically registered to vote? You know, like, is there like any important election dates that we need to keep our eyes out? Because I think people just hear about the election every four years on the presidential level, right? Like, and people tend to overlook like your local like primary elections or whatnot. So would you tell us a bit about registering to vote and then actually keeping up with all these election dates? And does anyone else wanna ask any other questions?
I had a question that we had come up with, and I think you kind of already touched on it a little bit. But so, as an organization, when you're working with government, what are some things that, whether it's advocates or organizations, tend to overlook when they're trying to reach out to government? What are some things that you would suggest to these organizations when trying to reach out to you, that you often see us forget because, like you say, we're so caught up in just trying to talk to someone and get our ideas out that we tend to overlook these things.
Yeah, okay. Great. I can start with that one real quickly. Kind of again, coming to the right person. So, oftentimes, I've heard of a lot of state legislators getting approached for Aurora Police Department reform, um, which they do have some say, the state legislation implements minimum training standards and then also some guidance for how to use body cameras. So it's standardized across the state. But a lot of it also comes from just APD themselves putting on that policy, and then also from the contract that the aldermen vote on with the police union. So I would say, maybe a state legislator isn't the first person you visit about police reform. I think that would be, your alderman from the city, Aurora City Council, and it would be the mayor. That's kind of, who you want to talk to. Same thing goes for, any state legislation stuff. You don't really want to go to the mayor for that. You want to come to your state's representative and your state senator. Also federal issues, you want to go to them. So kind of, I think one thing I've noticed with grassroots is not really fully knowing, and that's okay if you don't know, but maybe starting the question with, okay, here are the list of the things that we want to do. What is under your jurisdiction as a state legislator, as a alderman? And then they'll tell you like, well, here's what we do in regard to that issue. And you'll be like, okay, well, in that, and in those areas, I know that you set training, I know that you set the budget, here's what we want. So you can tailor your asks to what they can actually do based on their authority. I think the other thing is follow-up. Again, I mentioned like people rarely follow up, but continuously emailing, continuously calling. And again, it doesn't have to be necessarily adversarial, like you're not calling to yell at them, be like, why didn't you vote this way or what? I mean, you can if you really feel that way, but kind of being like, hey, like, do you have any updates on this? Or, hey, I thought that, we were gonna get this policy paper last week. I haven't gotten it yet. Can I reach out to somebody in your office who might have it or something like that? Just keep the follow-up, keep the conversation consistent. And then, just making sure that you have specific asks. So again, I think what makes people, legislators are approached by so many different people with so many different asks and problems. Like to be a legislator is just to hear about the problems of the world. That's your job, right? So you're like, but you're in a position where like, I want to act on it. So what makes it easier for them to act on is if you have a solution that they can be like, that sounds great, let's do that, and move on. So if you're just coming and being like, APD sucks, like they're just awful, they mistreat, they're kind of like, okay, I hear you, I just don't know, like what should we do about it? What do you want? But if you're like, here's what I want to see reformed at APD is blah, 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 A, B, and C, then that's action items that they can take, right? So thinking about being solution oriented, remember, keep the stories, keep the anger, bring it up, like vent, but then end with being solution oriented, and then, be consistent. In terms of registering to vote, I think that, unfortunately, I can't speak too much to it, but I will say that contact your county board of elections. So if you just Google like King County Board of Elections, and anytime I have a question about voting or registering, I just call them and I'm like, how does this work? What do you do? And they'll usually, give you your like, your county specific information. You can also call the Illinois State Board of Elections, but they sometimes might refer your county board of elections. So go to your county board of election. But yeah, most people tend to vote. Higher voter turnout tends to be every 4 years because there's, a lot of talk and media about, voting on November 3rd, 2020, right? But I think the turnout for local level elections is usually lower. I think the last mayoral election, 2017, it was only 17% of the registered voters ended up voting in the Aurora election. And I think it's only 89,000 people that were registered out of 200,000 people. And out of the 89,000, it was only 17% of them that actually voted. So it's a very small percentage, but it has a lot of, these people have a lot of say in how our day-to-day lives operate. So I would definitely say the next one, if you live in Aurora Township, there's an Aurora Township supervisor and trustee election, and I believe there's a primary for that on February 23rd, 2021. And then the city council and mayoral, and I'm not sure if there's other elected offices, I'd have to double check, is on April 6th, 2021. So, definitely getting people ready. I think what you guys can do as an organization is then start having candidate forums, for any candidates, invite them and ask them questions about your issues and your audience, and ask them to address, what would they do as an alderman, what would they do as a board member, whatever it is that you're looking at, and invite them to speak to you guys, and then get the word out for if you guys have a candidate, or if you guys don't have a candidate but just want people to vote, reminding people constantly, posting these dates all the time, just vote April 6th, blah blah blah, and then maybe having a little bit of voter education, because I think sometimes it's like, oh my god, I go to the ballot and there's all these names I don't know, like I'm just gonna pick Democrat, I guess, like, and I get it, there's so many of them, but ballotready.org is a good one, where it kind of shows you what your ballot might look like. It's not 100% accurate, so I will say you have to cross-check it with a few other references, but that might be something that you guys as an organization look at, or at least compile, be like, these people are going to be on your ballot, and you just link to their bios, and then people can read their bios or the platform or whatever. So thinking about how you guys as an organization can do some voter education as well, and then again, for the people that can't vote, kind of putting out the message that they can still contribute. Just because you can't vote doesn't mean you don't matter. That's not true at all. You matter just as much as a voter. And, one thing that they can do is volunteer with campaigns. If maybe you find a candidate that you're like, oh my God, she's amazing, I want her to be my next, board of trustee, I think she'd be good for Wabanzi, sign up to knock doors for her and introduce her to the community, sign up to make calls for her. Another thing that you can do is, and might be not people's favorite, is donate. Even if it's $3, I donate. I work for the state. I don't make a ton of money. I'm definitely not rich. But I still donate to my candidates that I think are underdogs, but that I think have great potential if they just had a little bit more money. I tend to donate like $3 or $5 here and there. I think my monthly contribution to candidates comes out to be $20 total. That's what, 3 beers. So it's not a ton that I give, but I think the support says a lot, right? And the reason why these candidates need money is because it takes a lot of money to run a campaign. It takes money to get your name out there, to buy Facebook ads, to buy yard signs, to rent a space for your campaign headquarters, to pay a campaign manager. These are all expenses that people undertake, and that's why you see a lot of people who are wealthy being able to start campaigns, because they just have the money to start, right? But like a lot of us in our community, like I don't have the money to just be like, oh, I'm just gonna rent an office space and hire a campaign manager and do it. Like, there's no way I could do that right now. I would have to fundraise like crazy, and but then that's kind of where we can, as a community, help each other out, is being like, don't worry, I got you. Like, if each of us here gave on the screen $5, that's $25, and that matters. So even if you can't vote, you still can be involved in electoral politics. You can volunteer, you can donate, and you can run for office yourself one day, and it might not be right now, but it might be at some point later on. And the information and the experience that you're gathering by doing all of this is really going to help you in your experience. And then also, you don't have to just run for office. There's ways you can be involved by just, sending an email. I have friends who are like super apolitical. They're like, oh, politics, like I'm an engineer, don't talk to me anything about politics, I hate all of it. And I'm like, okay. I was like, but like, can you just send one email to one legislator? And they're like, okay, fine. And then they make like one $5 contribution to a candidate that I like lobby for. I'm like, no, you really got to do it. And they're like, fine, leave me alone, here's $5. And then they're done. They go back to their lives, and then they can not think about politics, but they were engaged. That's what engagement looks like. And I will say that it can be daunting, and you can come in and out of it too. If you're like, I volunteered for a campaign, I got disillusioned because she lost, and I just really don't want to get it. Like, it's fine, take a little break, like you go live your life. And if later on you want to come back and you want to do it in a different way, then like it's totally possible. I think people sometimes feel like they have to choose between being like a full-time activist or being disengaged, and like, no, there's so many steps in between. So like whatever works for you at whatever time, like try to, but my full-time job is kind of government. So I actually sometimes try to have a little break where like I'm really engaged and I'm helping in the community. But then there's times where I'm like, you know what, I need a break. And so I don't do anything for a month, and I just watch movies and like go on vacation and whatever. But I need that self-care. And I think it's fine if you guys all take it too.
Totally. Yeah. Something important is to take a break all the time. Well, not all the time, but
Yeah, when you need it, and then come back.
I know it was mentioned before, like if you are registered to vote for the elections in November, you're automatically registered to vote for your local elections. Is that true?
Yeah, so you don't have to keep re-registering. So once you register to vote, you're good. The only thing I will say is if you move and your address changes, re-register. And felons in Illinois can vote, actually, as long as they're completely out of the criminal justice system. So they've ended their parole, they've ended their probation, they're kind of done with the system. They can vote, but they have to re-register. So, felons, if you change your name, so if you get married and you decide to change your name, you have to likely re-register to vote. So I would say any time where you think like this is like, think about it like in health insurance, right? You might have to change your health insurance when you have a qualifying life event or something, like, oh, you get married or a new job or something like that. Just keep voter registration in the back of your mind. And again, any questions, call your King County Board of Elections. I mean, I think they're sick of me because I always call and ask random questions like, oh, if a person has only like a driver's license or a state ID and not a driver's license, can they register? Or like, oh, well, what if the person, like lost their card and they only have the receipt? Is that, just things like that. So feel free to ask and also start thinking of, how can the system be improved? I think this is where you guys take notes. And there's a lot of groups out there that work on voter reform and voting reform. And so maybe it's not your primary issue, but you can like send in anecdotes. Again, it's qualitative information is really important. Some qualitative information as well, and quantitative information, and be like, hey, you guys are working on this in Illinois. Here was our experience. We had a particularly hard time with X County Board of Elections and just thought you should know. So keep thinking that you guys, whatever area that you work on, you have information that you can feed to other organizations. And again, that's kind of how this change works, is partnerships and building, and it's not on any one person. It can't be done by any one person. And so I think, working together is going to be key. And I'm sorry, was there another question? Did I miss something?
No, that was my question.
Okay. But yeah, so, thanks guys for having me on. I know that, it can be confusing, but I will say that even for people that work in government, it's confusing sometimes. And I think, so you definitely shouldn't feel like you don't know what's going on or that you're not good enough because of that. I will tell you, there are people at the very high levels of government that don't know what's going on. I mean, that's kind of evident right now.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
I just want you to know that like you have a story to share. Whatever your status is, you have a voice that matters. You have a voice that impacts your community, and you should use it however you feel most comfortable with. And lean on your friends. If you really don't feel comfortable, but you want to share it, there's other outlets. And there's ways to get about it, and even like blogging about something and getting some traction there. Or, maybe you guys do a whole bunch of letters to the editor and just get a bunch of, letters. I think that's something that seems a little archaic, and people are like, what are letters to the editor? And it's usually letters that the community members write to the newspaper in response to an issue or an article that was posted. And you're like, oh, actually, this is how I feel about it. And it may seem a little archaic and like a little old school, like who does that? But I think maybe with some older elected officials, this still matters, And so thinking about how does your elected official mostly communicate? If they're like a young, 25-year-old newly elected, you're probably going to reach out to them on social media. But if they're like a 78-year-old senator, like maybe not, right? Maybe you can't really slide into the DMs there. But but yeah, so kind of thinking about, you know, what might be the different ways, and it's also based on personality and age and kind of just a preferred mode. Like I'm really bad at texting, so I tell people don't like email me, like don't text me because I'm just really bad at texting. But you know, just kind of things like that, you know, keeping that in mind.
Well, thank you so much, Lily. I know that government can be very intimidating
Yeah.
and very confusing at times. So this was great to be able to have a little breakdown of how it all works and just kind of get more knowledge on how these things are run. Because I think that, to your point, even like elected officials themselves don't know what's going on at the time. So that's definitely true. So thank you so much, Lily. Thank you for taking the time out of your weekend, because I know you're busy all the time in the week. So thank you for taking the time out of your weekend to join us and provide your time. Does anyone else have any questions?
Do you have any social media you want to be followed on?
Not as much. I actually don't really use social media as much. I'm like a really bad millennial. I'm like, okay, I'm an older millennial, so maybe that's okay. But like, I mean, honestly, I can give you guys my email. Feel free to share it with your group. And yeah, it's so weird because people are always like, oh, like, why do you use email? I was like, I don't know. I can like triage my messages really well. It's so weird. But I'll definitely, yeah, I've been thinking. I was like, okay, maybe I should use social media more. In terms of doing some like community education. So I'll definitely keep you guys
Yeah.
posted.
I
And
think
then
a Twitter and Instagram would be great for you. We would love to see you on social media. I think that'd be awesome.
yeah, I'll have to try. I'm just like I tend to be a more private person,
Yeah.
but yeah, but I think you know this information needs to get out there, especially to people like us who just have been excluded from these conversations. And I keep saying this, but deliberately, right? When you're like, oh my God, like I don't feel like I'm part of this. Yeah, it's because people years and centuries ago didn't feel like you belonged, and they
Mhm.
excluded people that look like you and me,
Yeah.
right? Or who
Yeah.
talk Spanish, or who were from a different country, or who just
Mhm.
looked different. And
Yeah.
so, you know, thinking about how, you know, it's crazy. Sometimes I look at the founding fathers and I'm like, I don't belong there
They
at
don't
all.
represent us. Yeah.
But then,
Right.
yeah, I'm like, it's intimidating, right? To be like, oh, wait, what? I'm supposed to influence the system that these men created, you know?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, you look around and it's changing, and I think you guys are part of the change. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, thanks for having me.
So,
Thank you.
I have one last question that I just thought of. How often do you see like older Latinx people reach out to like officials and actually try to get change done? Because I feel like a lot of them really have like you can ask them and they have no idea where to even like begin.
That's a
Yeah,
great question.
Reach out, or
that's
how
a good question.
often do you think officials try to reach out to that specific group? Because I feel like a lot of them are trying to reach us, right? Like the younger generations, because they know we are the ones that are probably going to take more action. But do you feel like the older generations are being left out of trying to be like re-educated and being included into these things?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, to be honest, I don't think I've ever met with like an older, you know, person that I'm like, oh my gosh, she could be my tia, or like, you know, like I surprisingly haven't. But you know, I think there's multiple reasons for that. I think many of our older relatives come from countries where they don't trust the government because the government has abused them or is overtly corrupt, or you know, and so they come here with the mentality of like, oh, son ratas, you know, like why would I trust them? They're all thieves. They're all corrupt. So I think part of it might be a little bit of the culture, but I think also part of it, again, kind of elected officials, some of them, not all of them, definitely not all of them. There's ones who are making good headway, but you know, there's some of the older traditional, you know, white ones who kind of discount our community as a whole. Um, and I think, yeah, it comes from racism, it comes from ageism, it comes from, you know, they know their base, and they know who votes, and they cater to voters. And that's another thing that I don't think most people realize, is that your elected officials aren't really beholden to everybody they represent. I think some of them, not all of them, think that they're only beholden to their highest donors and to the people that vote the most and regularly. Because if you're trying to win a campaign, you try to get the most votes, right? So you're going to go after the people who actually vote. But, you know, I think that discounts undocumented people. I think that discounts people who are not fully sure if they can trust the government. I think that discounts people who have felt let down by the government. You know, they believed and now they're disillusioned. So I think that's kind of where you guys come in, and like you guys can uplift these people, and maybe you take your Thea to a meeting with a senator. I mean, you know, and kind of let her know that she belongs there. I think a lot of people feel intimidated by elected officials, especially, you know, the higher up they go. But I just want you to know they're beholden to you. Like they are there to be responsive to you. It's like if you went into a store and you wouldn't be like, oh my God, that's the manager of the store. You'd be like, no, this person is here to serve me. I'm the customer, right? And that's kind of how we should be thinking about these things. And, you know, having these cordial discussions and these back and forths where we come with people with real problems and real solutions, and try to get them to change it in a way that works for us. But yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think, you know, that's something you guys think about. Maybe you have a campaign where you engage your family members and you bring them along with the meeting. And maybe they're afraid because they're undocumented, or they only speak Spanish, or they're like, oh, I'm just a lowly, you know, factory worker. Like, why would I? And I think that's where you build up their confidence and be like, no, people should listen to you. Like, you have a story to tell. You are America. Like, you are the face of this country's workers. Like, if anybody deserves airtime, it's you. And, you know, you could be like, you don't have to say anything, I'll go with you, you know, and kind of, you know, you get your older relatives engaged, and maybe some of them, you know, can vote, and maybe they'll be like, oh my God, maybe I should register. Maybe some of them tell their nieces and nephews, you know, and they're like, oh my God, yeah, maybe you should vote, you know, and kind of this cascading effect. And that's what I tell sometimes people too who are undocumented. I was like, but some of you might have family members that are citizens, you know, and tell them to vote for you and on your behalf, and tell them to get registered, because even though you can't vote right now, like, you have people who can vote for you. And so, but again, it kind of is building that trust with them and making them feel heard and valued, and then they'll be able to really start getting engaged in the process. But yeah, great question.
Yeah, no, thank you again, Lily, for taking the time to join us and answering all these crazy questions.
I know it was great to have you, Lily. I know you didn't share any social media, but we'll be having your email. Since anyone doesn't have anything else to say, I guess that concludes our Platica for this week. Thank you guys for, again, tuning in. And we hope to see you in our next Platica.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
Bye.
Lily. Bye. Have a great
Bye.
weekend.